Thank you so much for coming tonight. Before I introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, I wanted to thank Terry Johnson so much for sponsoring and doing a lot of organizing for this event. None of it would happen without her, as well as, let's applaud for Terry Johnson. She's fantastic. All right, and then also thank you to the other co-sponsoring organizations, which include the Coalition for Diversity and Social Justice, the Diversity Enrichment Committee, the Race and Ethnicity Studies Program, the McMichael Fund, and the Division of Student Affairs. Please remember, immediately following tonight's presentation, there will be a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session, and after that, the CDSJ is hosting a short reception in the Cross Cultural Center, which is right next door in Prothero, so that we can all meet and chat with our speaker, Dr. David Pilgrim. So Dr. Pilgrim is most known for his role as the founder and curator at the Jim Crow Museum, which is an 11,000-piece collection of racist artifacts located at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. The museum uses objects representative of intolerance to teach tolerance. His writings, scholarly and creative, are used by students, scholars, and civil rights workers to better understand historical and contemporary expressions of racism. He has also helped create an award-winning documentary to explain his approach to battling racism, as well as traveling exhibits of objects found in the Jim Crow Museum. Dr. Pilgrim serves as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Ferris State University and is considered to be one of the nation's leading experts on issues related to multiculturalism, diversity, and race relations. He is an applied sociologist who earned his doctorate from Ohio State University and believes that racism can be studied objectively and creatively assailed. His goal is to get people talking about issues of diversity and race relations in meaningful ways, and then to go and do something positive. Without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Dr. David Pilgrim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody's been really nice. I will try to be respectful of your time. Oh, by the way, I should go back to that quote. I guess you've all read it by now. I'll reference it later. Some of the images that I'm going to show you are a little bit offensive. For some people, to some others, they will greatly offend. I don't do that to tantalize. I don't do it to offend. I do it simply because I have to show you what I'm talking about, otherwise you won't know what I'm talking about. By the way, that particular piece we don't own. That's a Halloween mask. The person wanted $5,000 for it, and with $5,000 I could do a lot with other pieces, so I didn't buy it. But it was a Mardi Gras Halloween mask. It is, those of you that are collectors will understand me when I say this, it is an outstanding piece, and I wish I had it for teaching purposes, but we didn't get it. We are the largest publicly accessible collection of racist objects. This is going to be hard for you, isn't it, me walking around? Just work with it. We also have starting a collection which has about 2,500 pieces of sexist objects, and the goal there is to create a sexism museum. The United States has had African American museums, Black Studies museums, but they have not had a racism museum. Similarly, we've had women's museums, women's accomplishment museums, but not a sexism museum. So there's some of us who believe that the best way to study something is to look at the worst expressions of it. Okay. So I bought my first piece when I was 12 years old. I was born in Harlem, but I was raised in Mobile, Alabama, and so here I was, this multiracial red and black kid growing up in Alabama. Actually, I could tell you a lot about, I don't want to bore you with this, I could tell you a lot about my ancestry because I'm writing a memoir now, and I'm learning stuff. So I found out that on my father's side, I have ancestors from Venezuela, Trinidad, and Barbados, the countries that our president referred to as, what was the term he used? Okay. Oh, this is a religious school, so we can't say that? Yeah. Well, all right. Well, whatever it was, actually when he said it, I thought he was talking about Indiana. But apparently he wasn't talking about Indiana. So I was 12 years old. I saw a piece. It was a combination antique. I said that I was in some state, and I said, well, when he first said that, I thought he meant Indiana, and then someone yelled, "Indiana's not a country." So they didn't get the joke. So anyway, it was a combination antique carnival resort thing where there were, the Ferris wheels and stuff, but there were also dealers selling things. And so I bought the piece, and I broke it. And I don't think it was philosophical. I don't know what I was thinking. I was like 11 years old. I just didn't like it, And, it's weird because someone has stolen my story. There's now someone, and I've heard about this. I haven't seen it yet, but someone's they were in some documentary, and they were talking about the story. And I was like, hey, they stole my story, right? I don't know who that handsome devil is, but in the I think it was around 1994, I donated about 3,500 objects to the place where I teach right now, which is Ferris State University. And we weren't a museum. We were just visual storage. And you don't have to be a teacher. I don't know if any of you in here, any of the students, if you plan on becoming teachers, and if you argue about teaching pedagogy and the good ways to teach, the poor ways to teach, whatever you think about that, you look at this picture. You don't have to be an educator. You don't have to be a sociologist to realize there's learning going on in that room. And that's what I thought. I thought we could take these objects because they're so powerful, and you just ask people the question, what is it you see? And then you let the learning begin. So I think one of the sad things about our culture is that we're becoming ahistorical. I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist walking through the past, paying attention. But it's mind-boggling how little we know about what really happened in the past. And so when I ask people, like, who was Jim Crow, a lot of them don't know what Jim Crow was. And even the ones who give an answer, they'll say something like, well, that's those whites-only signs or those no Negroes things. That's like, yeah, that's part of it. Jim Crow was on stage was a white guy who blackened his face, pretended to be black, adopted a stage persona, acted a fool, and he wasn't the first person. He wasn't the first person of white, black, or whatever to blacken their face and to create a stage character, but he was the first one to get famous doing it. And this was in 1829, and the world hasn't changed that much. If someone does something, they get rich and famous, you're going to have imitators. And it wasn't more than 5 or 10 years before minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy, had become arguably the first national entertainment in the U.S. and in England. So I have a theory, which is that it was African Americans who took that name Jim Crow from the character and applied it to all the things that put them down. So if you were a black person and you saw this white guy dressed in blackface and he's acting a fool, and he is acting in ways that support your oppression, then maybe it makes sense, as Frederick Douglass did in 1839, to refer to a Jim Crow car, that a segregation car, as a Jim Crow car. And so it came on, that idea that things that put us down, all of that's Jim Crow. So my two biggest fears, my first fear, this is going to sound so weird, my first fear was that I would die before the Jim Crow Museum was built. And it's really interesting because you like the way that slid in like that? It took me like 30 minutes to make that thing do that. But I was on 131 in Michigan. I don't expect you would know that, but it's one of the major highways. It was one of those days where, like today in Michigan, where the sun is out, but the roads are slick, and you think it's fine. And so I was driving 80 because I thought the roads were fine. And I had my car on cruise control because I don't make good decisions. And I looked down the road, and I saw 5 cars off. One person had passed away. I didn't know it at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, people in Michigan don't know how to drive. And as soon as I thought that, I hit whatever they hit. I was driving a Buick Lucerne, which you can see what's left of it. and made a beeline into a tree, and the museum was scheduled to open the week after that, okay? So that was my first fear, that I would die. My second fear was that African Americans, especially my elders, that they wouldn't like it, that they would see it as a shrine to racism, that they would think, wow, why is he doing that? Why is he bringing that back to memory? Now, it is the case that periodically happens, although it's very rare. We have civil rights groups, human rights groups, we have church groups, we're close to Detroit, you know. We have people come there all the time. Many of them are African Americans, my age and older, and my fears did not come to fruition. I mean, they thank me for the museum. They thank us for the museum. So our goal is to use objects of, quote, intolerance to teach tolerance. On our college campuses today, there's a lot of talk about triggers and creating safe environments. Well, my approach is a little bit different, and that is, I believe an environment can be safe, but if we're going to do real learning, it shouldn't be comfortable. And we should provoke people, and we should get folks thinking deeply about things they otherwise wouldn't want to talk about. Although I'll go back for a minute, one of my lessons is this, and I developed this mainly as working in a museum, but also in a classroom, and that is, I try to never crush anyone. I watch colleges pay speakers to come in, and they, on the left and the right, they demean students, they yell at students, they show off, they crush the person. Well, this is what I learned about crushing people. If I crush someone, I can't teach them after that. And not only can I not teach them, I can't teach anyone who witnessed it. That doesn't mean I don't push back. It doesn't mean I don't push hard, but I don't crush them. I don't need that 15 minutes of cathartic release at the expense of a student or anyone else. So, history. I'm not a historian. Like I said, most people think I'm a historian. I'm not a historian. So, I've come to history late in the sense of trying to understand the past. So this is one. Any historians in here? Here. So I'll direct all my criticism toward you specifically. I haven't read your stuff, but I'm sure it's bad. All right. So what's your role here at the school? President. So I know it's bad. All right. In terms of see, I do that. I'm a vice president, so interim president. So it might not be as bad then. Okay. I'm speaking administrator to administrator here now. So one of the things that I didn't make a distinction between was the past and history. So the past is what happened. History is what we say is important about what happened. The more I studied the past, the more I realized that's not what I read in history. And I'd like to read this to you. It's not especially profound, but I want you to hear it. Americans like happy history. Narratives that make us look smart, brave, and exceptional. We want a history that has been cherry-picked, one that ignores our mistreatment of the weak and disfavored, a history that can be celebrated at picnics, parades, and in smug conversations. This approach to history is neither honest nor mature. Again, it's not especially profound. It's what I believe now, having spent the last 10 years or so trying to understand the past in this country, and then reading the accounts of the past. We study the past because it happened, and we live in the residue. People say to me, why do we need a Jim Crow museum? Why do we need to study? Well, why study anything in history? You only want to study the happy. Why study anything? As a matter of fact, why study? Why do art? Why do philosophy? Why do anything? You can't just do the part you want to do. It happened. It happened. That's the justification, right? That's enough to say, this happened. And I need a proper, accurate understanding of what happened. In addition to that, we live in the residue. All right? We live in the residue. There is not one, and by the way, now we've actually exceeded, I think, 16,000 pieces in the museum because someone did a Vice News thing on us, and now thousands of pieces have come into the museum over the last 6 months. So we're up, I think we're around 16,000 pieces. Those pieces, every one of them, every depiction of African Americans as Toms and Sambos and Coons and Pickaninnies and all these caricatures, every one of them, many of them which were created in the 1800s, are being created today. There is not a single image in the Jim Crow Museum which is not being repeated today. Don't get it twisted. I'm not suggesting that we're living in the 1890s. I'm simply saying the imagery never died. So this is some of the residue. When I saw that t-shirt, I had to have it. That Any White Guy in 2012, that sums it up, right? I mean, that sums it up. That's a brand new piece. I'm so happy that I did not stop collecting pieces once we got out of the Jim Crow period. In other words, the period from the 1870s to the 1960s. That's why I called it the Jim Crow Museum, because the pieces in my original collection were all from that period. But I never stopped collecting. So pieces that belittled, mocked, degraded African Americans that were created after that, I kept collecting. And so we have a section of the Jim Crow Museum which are pieces that were all made this year. So we believe in the triumph of dialogue. Isn't that corny and it's trite, right? But I say to people, if you don't believe in the triumph of dialogue, stop talking. If you don't think words matter, shut up, right? I mean, why are we still talking? I believe in the triumph of dialogue. And if you're an educator and you believe in higher education, then you believe in the power of conversation, intelligent conversation. One of the interesting things about race is, sometimes when I go to a place, people will say, if you just stop talking about race, racism will go away. Have you heard that kind of thing? That doesn't even make stupid sense. I mean, the reality is people talk about race all the time. They talk about it in the hallway. They talk about it in the ball games. They talk about it in the kitchen. They talk about it every place people organize. They talk about race. But they don't talk about it in places where their ideas can be challenged. And that's what we've created. So I was speaking at Stanford, and a student raised his hand. This was years ago, and he said, I can summarize your whole collection in one word. And I'm thinking, I have to watch myself. I've tried to curse 3 times so far, and no, I'm not going to let it fly. I'm better than that. You know what I'm saying? I can be better than that. As my grandmother said, just think deeper. But she was wrong about other stuff. But anyway, so he stood up, and I said, okay, fine, Stanford guy. Tell me what one word is the umbrella term for all of my stuff. And he said, propaganda. And I was like, wow, that actually is true, right? That actually is true. The little guy is right. So by propaganda, I always thought of propaganda as a grainy old film, as a leaflet. You know what I mean? I thought about it in those kind of ways. I didn't think of an ashtray as propaganda. I didn't think of a postcard as propaganda. But the reality is any object can be used to disseminate information, to persuade people to view another people a certain way. And that is what happened. So if you can name an object, any object, we probably have a version of it in the Jim Crow Museum, which means it functions also as propaganda. The reason I say also as propaganda is because it has a functionality separate. In other words, an ashtray is also an ashtray. And so the fact that it's a caricatured black person in the ashtray as propaganda, but it's being used every day by the person. You get what I mean? It's not just a concept. I put this up here not because of any other reason than to remind myself to tell you that we produce 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, all the way up to an hour videos which are useful in college classrooms. So This one's called Blacks as Targets. And I got to use a bad word here, so work with me. But the hitting of black people was common in this country. And there was a game called Hit the Niggas. And if you go on our website, and actually if you come in the museum, we have the game there. And there's African Dodger. And if you knew Walter Johnson, the baseball player, was the first baseball player that we believe threw the ball 100 miles an hour. We have records of him going in to these carnivals where a black person would stick their head through an opening. And the person would get real baseballs, and 3 for a nickel, and they would throw at the face of the person, often, not often killing them, although that did happen, but often injuring them. Well, eventually, real black people were replaced by plastic or wooden blacks, or symbolic violence, and then today that has morphed into the game where when you throw, you hit the target and the person falls into the water. I don't know, you see those games. Now, why is this relevant? Go to your health programs, go to medical journals, talk to people that do medical research, and they will tell you when they do research on perceptions of others' pain, that the perception, a dominant perception is that black and brown people do not experience physical pain as much as white people. All right? Well, that's relevant if you're in a hospital. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, that matters. And so that old idea that black people's heads were harder, that black people didn't feel pain as much, that still exists. And beyond that was the idea that the pain inflicted on black people could be used as entertainment for others. Blackface is in the news again. How many of you remember Al Jolson? So Al Jolson was in The Jazz Singer, one of the first great American movies, dressed in blackface, acting with black people. I mean, that is amazing, right? So as a white guy dressed in blackface, okay, I guess you'd have to be there. All right. Most of you remember Little Black Sambo. Now, the students may not remember that it took the NAACP in the 1940s and 1950s in a concerted nationwide campaign to rid Little Black Sambo from elementary schools. It was the preferred textbook in many schools for children. That was their introduction to black people. Christopher Bing, I'm not trying to be funny, the wonderful illustrative artist, actually one of the best in the United States, redid the book Little Black Sambo, and he and I were arguing about it, and I said to him, this was on NPR, I said to him, tell me your story. And his story was that when he was young, Little Black Sambo, this brave little boy who outwits the tigers, in a country, by the way, which doesn't have tigers. But anyhow, he outwits the tigers and eventually gets them to run around a tree so fast that they turn into butter, and they make pancakes out of them. All right? So he says that story, and I don't think he's not being truthful, that story reminded him of good times spent with his parents and his grandparents. That it was in two ways good for him. It was nostalgic in that way, but that he also saw the little boy as smart and clever, and he didn't see this other piece. And what I said to him was, yeah, okay, that's fine for you, but for a lot of people, Little Black Sambo represented the vestiges of enslavement and segregation, and in every black neighborhood in this country, a dark-skinned black person was called Sambo, or Little Black Sambo. And I challenged him, instead of cleaning up an old racist story, why not just tell a new story? There's no limit on stories. You understand what I mean? Make up a new one. I'll give you an example, I'm going to go a little faster here, but I'll give you an example of the way we do our work. I'm going to ask you the question that's here. What is it you see? So and don't censor yourself. I did this at the University of Michigan, and they're so intent on not saying anything racist that the students were afraid to answer the question. All right? Now, I know what it is you see, or at least I know the items you see because I'm the one put it on the board. So what is it you see here? Yes? Okay. What else? Okay. So no one asked you for the real answer. Yes, that's actually... Spoiler alert. All right. So first of all, let's go this. What's the object itself? It's a license plate, which is an everyday object, which someone puts on their car, which means, remember I talked about propaganda? This is on a person's car riding around in a town, presumably, right? So in the 1960s, there was the idea of the new Negro and the new Democrat. Well, the person with this is basically saying that the new Negro and the new Democrat are still just what? Rats. And you know that we have prioritized and ranked animals. So that if I look at you and I say to one of you, you're an eagle, or you're a dove, right? That has a certain meaning. But if I say you're a pig, a snake, or a rat, that has other meanings. So this is a playing card. The interesting thing about toys and games is that they are especially pernicious ways to spread racist ideas. And this is something, I have my students play games that are racist games, and you know what happens? They just start trying to win. Do you see the significance of that? In other words, at a certain point, you just accept the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, whatever that's in the game, and you don't even see it anymore. Now you're just trying to win the game, whether it's old maids. So anyway, that's a game. That 1907, that's a postcard. It says, this question about the nigger race, it suddenly am no bluff, but dim's one thing you can't deny, we's always up to snuff. Those of you that read old newspapers, and by the way, for $150 or so, you can get a subscription to newspapers.com and read literally hundreds of thousands of newspapers. I do it every night. I'm not exaggerating. Every night, that's what I do. That's how I write. A lot of what I write is from old newspapers. It just boggles my mind that how long it was in this country that major newspapers just referred to black people in a way that we now consider a slur, just as a description. The idea here, what do you see here? Anyone? What do you see? First of all, what is the object? It's a postcard. So what's going on in the postcard? Anyone? Yeah, someone's being attacked, but what's going on? Look at it, yes. By alligator? I don't know, is it a jungle? Okay, let's go with that. What else? So what's the message here? Yes. Like someone's watching? Oh, okay. I tell you, every time I do this, someone says something, I'm like, I've been looking at this postcard 40 years and I've never seen that. Okay, so that's good. All right, so what's the real message here? Yes. Okay, and that we're food. We're not at the top of the food chain. All right, it is a very coarse way of saying that you're the other, right? You're not a real human. You're food for animals. So most of us have seen this. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Can I tell you, sometimes people ask me, they're like, so what's the worst thing? You want to hear a little bit of that? I'll give you a little bit of that. I'll give you one that's not as bad, and I'll give you one that's the absolute worst. I told you earlier that whites, and then later black people, by the way, dressed in blackface, got on stage. This was big entertainment, first professionally, and then amateurs would dress in blackface, even until like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? Colleges, churches, and others would use it as fundraising. Now we have governors getting in trouble because, our prime ministers, because people find them in the old yearbooks from fraternities. What you've never seen written is that from the late 1890s into the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s in this country, there were many examples of white people dressing in blackface and committing murders and rapes and robberies. Now, what do you think happened after that? Some black person probably was. Now, for those of you that, the best way to learn is to suspend judgment, listen, and then go and see if what the person said is true. I don't even ask that. Just assume I'm lying and go and do research, all right? So my most recent book, I have a section in it which takes dozens of examples from major American newspapers where they simply reported that the person had been black in their face and disguised as a Negro. So that's the one. I won't give you the other one. So Jim Crow, this system with whites at the top, peoples of color at the bottom, which presumed that that the lowest white person was superior to the highest black person, whatever those things mean. That system could not have worked without violence. The Equal Justice Institute down in Montgomery, now they have this monument. Actually, there's a movie coming out about Bryan Stevenson. I think it just came out or whatever. Just Mercy. I heard him speak there. They're a wonderful speaker. They found over 4,000 public lynchings of black people, including hundreds that we didn't even know about. The relationship, the reason I put this here is because the idea of the black brute, the black savage, the black criminal was used as justification for killing black people. And you see an example of this here. And then you see a trade card with a black person with a straight razor, which was the symbol of black criminality in the white imagination. So I want you to not read this. Stop reading it. Stop reading it and let me read it to you. Because it reads like fiction. It reads like flash fiction. You know what flash fiction is? It's these like one paragraph short stories. So let me read this to you. James Sanders, 25, was what white folks in the Deep South refer to contemptuously as an educated nigger. Instead of chopping cotton, he liked to sit in the shade of a willow tree on the creek bank and scribble diatribes. But Sanders' 3 R's proved his undoing. He wrote a letter to a young Hinds County white girl. The girl's family said the letter was indecent and insulting. A posse shot Sanders dead. I mean, that reads like you know what I mean? Like, that reads like fiction, like horrible fiction, but fiction, like flash fiction, except that's not fiction. And if you notice, the newspaper doesn't condemn it. It doesn't draw a moral line. It's simply saying they killed him. So on our college campuses now, like at Ferris, we just had posters and prints, I don't know if you've had them here, that say it's okay to be white. And immediately, the campus was getting ready to blow up, right? Because it's set up that way. Now, I have the advantage of spending too much of my life on white supremacy websites, and so I know that 10, 15 years ago, someone suggested this idea that let's put out this statement that says it's okay to be white, and that way, those on one side will say, well, this is from white supremacists, and so put it down, but then those on the other would say, are you saying that it's not okay to be white? Right? And so it was this situation that was designed where there was no win in it. And we had posters on our campus, and President, I don't know if you've checked, but there's been like about 150 colleges so far. This is the way I approached it. And this is why you should have a person on your staff all the time who works with racist stuff. I simply said this: we're going to tell the story of how these things happened. And so we're going to talk about when this started 15 years ago. We're going to look at what the initial purpose of it was, how it was intended to divide people, and then we're not going to be divided. In other words, we're going to turn it into a learning opportunity. I wish, this is some people dressed in blackface. You see that Michigan right there. I'm a proud graduate of the Ohio State University. So I wish that actually was from Michigan, or were from Michigan, whatever it is. But it's not. It's actually at Clemson, and someone's just wearing Michigan stuff. So I just want to be accurate about that. And on the other side, that's actually a photograph from like the 1930s. And by the way, if you're going to dress in blackface, do your legs too. That's not a commitment. You know what I mean? That's not a commitment to the whole thing. This is Martin Luther King Day celebration, January 2007 at Tarleton. I'm sure some of you remember that, where people dressed up in or actually mocked Dr. King. This is Kansas State University 2016. This is Oklahoma State University 2017, celebrating our first MLK Day off of school. And you don't need off and of like that. So if you study old posters and old movies, then when you saw the cover of Vogue that had LeBron James on it, then you think to yourself, okay, is there something here? So one of the things we would do in the museum is we would show people the old posters. We'd show them the cover here, and we ask them a question. What is it you see? That's all. We have two traveling exhibits. One's called Hateful Things, and those are pieces from the museum itself, just Jim Crow-related pieces. But then we also have another one called Them, Images of Separation, and that has objects that defame poor whites, Jews, members of the LGBT community, Christians, just any number of groups. And but in this one right here, I put this up here because I wanted to show you that target over to the right. And that was a target actually mocking, of course, Trayvon Martin. This is really, only a couple years ago, so you remember the incident involving Serena Williams. So you probably thought about it, but one of the things that jumps out at me is look at her opponent. Now, you know her opponent, right? Her opponent is a brown-skinned woman whose, I think, ancestry is Haitian and Japanese. Is that what it is? Yeah. It's Haitian and Japanese. She doesn't look like that. But that feeds into that old idea of the black person insulting and threatening and challenging the white person. And on the other side, you have a trade card. This is really old. This is from the turn of that other century, 1900s. And that's feeding into the idea of the black woman emasculating the black man. If you have access to this sweater, I need it. I think it's like $1,200, so I don't want to spend that. So if you have one of those. Again, in the museum, we don't say, despite the name of the museum, we don't say something's racist. Because people come in and they'll look at something and they'll go, what's wrong with this? And like, okay, first of all, you just passed a lynching tree. You don't want to talk about that, but that's okay. What we have are objects that help us talk about race relations and racism. We're not saying it is racist. We want to have people talk. So like a mammy image, and we have some of our best conversations about things like Aunt Your Mama because one person sees it once again as something that reminds them of good times spent with their families. Someone else sees something related to enslavement and segregation. The stable genius, if you would, of the museum is that it puts people in a space where those two groups can listen to each other. So our work also focuses on the resiliency of African Americans. I was just in Little Rock, and I'll tell you a real quick story if you don't mind. Our campus, the art, A-R-T, the art on our campus is profoundly white. And by that I mean there's hardly any other art, any representations of people of color in the art. And so in my job as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, a guy who works in my office, I said to him, I think the first African-American student here is Gideon Smith, right? Because that's what everybody thought. So I said to him, go find a picture of Gideon Smith. And so we're going to build like a little something for him just to put it out there with everybody, with all the other art. And he came back with a picture that had 3 black people in it, and Gideon was one of them. And I said to him, so who are these other 2 people? He says, I don't know. I said, well, why the hell would you bring me the picture? Go find out who these other 2 people are, okay? I mean, that's ridiculous that you would come to me with the, okay? So he goes out, and he came back, and he says, hey, you're not going to believe this. And I'll talk to you a little bit. But this person came to Ferris, and he did this great stuff. And this guy came to Ferris, and he did this great. And no one on our campus knew any of that, right? And so and by the way, they were all from Virginia, these guys he was finding. And he found, at this point, because I started researching it, we found like 70 of them. And they were all from Virginia, coming up to Ferris between 1910 and 1925. Our archivists didn't know. We pay people to teach history. We give them a check every 2 weeks. None of them knew, right? So anyway, as we were looking for those people, we actually found people that were here before them. One of them was this guy here, Chester E. Bush. And Chester E. Bush's father was a member of Booker T. Washington's council, Negro Council. He was a very successful business person, his father, John Bush. And they started something called the Mosaic Templars, right? And it was this insurance company, it was factories, and they became rich. They moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, and Chester Bush helped start the NAACP in Little Rock, which, by the way, was the NAACP that got national news when the kids tried to go to the school in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? Remember that story? Anyway, we ended up talking to Chester E. Bush's grandson, who's still alive, and walked into his home, and we learned a lot, and we taught. He didn't know his grandfather had gone to Ferris, right? So the museum doesn't just deal with the horrible stuff. It also is a way of saying, despite all these things, despite the lynchings, the 4,000 plus lynchings, despite preachers for decades, centuries even, standing up saying that segregation was the will of God and telling lies about the curse of Ham and the government sanctioning segregation in ways that would blow your mind. Birmingham, blacks and whites couldn't play checkers together, all that foolishness. People couldn't be buried in the same place. A whole nation, every major societal institution in the nation set up to substantiate a racial hierarchy, which was basically a racial caste. Despite all of that, African Americans did wonderful things, right? So we also talk about some of those things. Like, here's one guy, Percival Prattis. He's one of the people we found who came to Ferris. In 1947, he became the first African American admitted to the press corps of the United States. And that's back when we did press conferences. Okay. Hold on. Gideon Smith, by the way, which is the guy we started with, he actually became the first varsity athlete at Michigan State University and later became a fairly well-known science teacher. Russell E. Dixon became the dean of the dental school at Howard University and produced 1/2 of all the black dentists in the United States. This is my favorite, Belford Lawson. How many of you have heard the name Belford Lawson? No one has heard the name Belford Lawson. Belford Lawson is the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court. It was not Thurgood Marshall. He was sitting in the audience. It was Belford Lawson, and that's one of our students from Ferris. And no one knew these stories. So here's a couple things toward the end I'd like to give you. I challenge, when I go places, I challenge every place, the people in the place I go, do something. Now, people say to me, some people say to me, we don't like the way you do it. It's too in your face, it's too nasty, it's too, it's uncomfortable. And, I'll show you a quote from H. Ross Perot. The activist is not the I don't like the word man in this case, but the activist is not the man who says the river is dirty, but is the man who cleans the river. So I don't mind when people criticize the way we do it, but I would listen to their criticism more if their pant legs were wet. I mean, it's easy to just stand on the side of the bank and go, oh, we don't like this. And then we have people, again, who come into an area, tell you the river is dirty, and then get on the plane and go home. Well, that's not helping. I mean, we need to get in the river and clean it. So, you know, at the University of Ohio University, they had this, and I'm a little bit jealous because we have the objects that they have, so we could have done this. But they created this campaign, and it's been very successful nationally, where it's basically I'm Not a Costume campaign. And they take all these different groups, and you know yourself that Halloween is a nasty time of the year. It's a nasty time of the year. You know, I didn't know this for many years until I started going to Halloween stores, the racist, sexist, homophobic, all these costumes. And by the way, when a person puts on a racist costume, they act a certain way when they have the costume on. Doesn't that make sense? Yeah. I mean, you don't have to know Irving Goffman and whatever else, but they present a certain self. You know, their gait, G-A-I-T, changes. Their language pattern changes. They walk a certain way. The whole thing changes. So I guess I'm showing you this to challenge you to do something. And I'm not assuming that you're not already doing some things, but I challenge you to do something, and to do something big, to do something that just pushes people. We're going to build a new Jim Crow museum. I mean, our motto is no check is too large. But we're going to be, right now we're located in a basement, which, by the way, it has a symbolic meaning. I chose it like that. It's also, if you know anything about college campuses, it's hard on college campuses to find space for anything. People fight over space. We're in a library, and librarians will use books to keep you from moving and expanding. You know, my joke is that librarians use books the same way wolves use urine to mark territory. But well, maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but we're going to build a 2-story space, and I'll tell you why. One reason is we've recently received, I'm almost done. We've recently received a collection of Bruce Davison photographs, and so when you look in your history textbooks and you see those famous iconic images in there of Martin Luther King and some of the others, a lot of those were taken by Bruce Davison, and we received the original photographs. Well, we don't have the capacity to be good stewards of that right now. We've received other collections like that. It also gives us a chance to tell other stories. Like one of the stories we need to tell is, why is this museum in Michigan and not in Alabama? Why is it at a historically white college? Which, by the way, makes no sense to me. The museum is about racism, which is about race relations. Why should that be at a black place? Does that make, you understand what I'm saying? It would actually make more sense the other way. But quite honestly, it doesn't matter where it is as long as we're having the conversations. Isn't that beautiful? And you see that brown piece there? That's our conception of a river, because the river has played an important role in both African cultures, and by that I mean the 50-plus nations, but also African American. I mean, so, you know, we talk about crossing the river, be baptized in the river. Even sometimes when I go back to Alabama and people will say, I hope I see you again on this side of the river. Henry Louis Gates, I'm just dropping names like crazy. Henry Louis Gates, one of the friends of the museum, he had a documentary which included us, but it was called Many Rivers to Cross, right? And so we put a river there. And it also inside will be mosaics, because to be African American is to not be one anything. I mean, it's many colors, it's many views, it's many expressions. It's a mosaic. So that's the quote I mentioned earlier. The activist is not the man. I wish it just said the activist is not the one. The activist is the one who cleans the river. So thank you very much. So I went fast so we'd have time for some questions or comments. So, anyone? Yes. Yeah. 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 So that's a great question. I was not the best person to be collecting this stuff for a couple reasons. I did not have a plan. I was just buying the stuff I could afford. And actually, my original collection of 3,500 pieces weren't even, that's not a sample of what I saw. It's a sample of what I could afford. So most of the time, I was just trying to find something where I could get a good price, you know. Now it's different. Now we have a group of, well, we have two reasons it's different. One is, for the last 400 plus days, when we go to work every day, there are boxes of stuff that come unsolicited. And so in that sense, now we got to figure, and I never thought I would have gotten to the point where I'm actually thinking we need a policy of not accepting something. Because I was an obsessive collector. I spent decades, you know, collecting this stuff. So the idea of telling someone we don't want it is crazy. But then I'm not the one who has to accession it, right? I mean, when I walk in there, they just look angry at me all the time because they have to write the little numbers, they have to and it's a long process just to accession one piece, you know. So, so we're not quite there yet to that point, except for the objects that we spend money on, and we don't spend a lot of money anymore. Now, if I spend money, I gotta really want a piece, which means I gotta, like, I'll give you one that a couple things I really want. First, I want that mask. I can't let that go. But I'd like to have a uniform, a peonage uniform. And so, you know, after enslavement was over, there was the re-enslavement of black people doing peonage, right? Debts, servitude, at all. Well, we don't have one of the uniforms that the black, quote, convict would wear, and I think that's such a powerful piece. I don't like making this stuff. There's very few, there's probably 3 or 4 pieces in our museum that we created, because I don't like doing it. I like having original stuff, right? But I'm tempted that we may have to, because we can't find one of these raggedy old things from the 1920s, right? Another one I think is, that I'd like is a porter, because the railway porters, the sleeping car porters were such an important part. And so we have a cap, and we have the top part, but we don't have the bottom. So stuff like that I really want. And I already know what we're gonna say about it, right? Also, in the new museum, we're gonna have a whole section just on Michigan. Just on Michigan. And so, and Michigan, of course, every state has a racial history. You trust me, you got one in Texas, Brownsville and stuff, right? And you're adding to it all the time, right? So, but like the Detroit riots, you know, the dividing of Detroit in the whole 8 Mile thing. That's a fascinating story, that whole 8 Mile piece. But I live in Grand Rapids. I didn't even know this. We had a Mammy's Kitchen in Grand Rapids with a big Mammy thing out front, you know, big sign and whatever. Boy, I'd love to have one of those signs, you know, kind of thing. So, and then of course, Michigan has a strong history of civil rights. And so you have one of the more powerful NAACPs in Michigan, and they've done some symbolic things, like they buried Jim Crow in the 1940s. Recently, they buried the N-word. You know, it was a symbolic act, because I said it earlier, you know. But I only say it for teaching. Here's a piece on that. I did some work for the CIA, right? And by the way, I'll say this on tape. They're in Chantilly, Virginia. All right, just so. So I took a team in there, and we were doing some sensitivity stuff, which for me means we're going to really get into some serious conversations. This ain't playing, right? And so I had a shirt, and it had these young black men. They were doing stuff like, one was urinating on the street, one had a big boom box. It was just a silly caricature shirt, and it was from like the 1980s or something. Maybe it was the 90s because it had the word Crooklyn on it. And so I had a group. My group had 15 people. I had 15 or 16 people in it. Obviously, these are all professionals. And so I held up the shirt, and I said, "So what is it you see?" And they didn't want to tell me what they saw. And I said, "No, I mean, if we're going to talk, we're going to talk. So tell me, what is it you see?" I thought they were going to do like, well, there's a young guy urinating here. He has his shoe there. This guy has a boomer. And almost in unison, they all said, "We see niggas." And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. So the teacher in me, the facilitator in me, tries to not preach to people. I'm trying to facilitate a discussion, right? So I said, well, wait a second. I said, why is it you see that? And so the conversation was something like this. Well, look what he's doing. I mean, there was a young girl with a baby on her hip. This young guy was, urinating in the street, whatever. And I was like, yeah, but why don't you just say you see someone urinating? They're going on and on. And finally, they got frustrated with me. And one of them said to me, "Didn't you fly in here through D.C.?" And I said, "Yeah, that's how you get here." They said, "Well, then you know what we're talking about, right? Because, D.C. is one of the blackest cities in the country." I said, "Okay, that's enough." I said, "So let me ask you this. When you look at the images of the civil rights movement and you see those power hoses, because they weren't, people always say, well, the folks shot water. No. They weren't shooting water at that wasn't a hose. That was a power hose. It could strip the bark off of a tree. It could knock you up against a building, right? It could injure you. And those dogs, those weren't service animals. All right. I said, so when you see those images, do you see niggas? Because if they weren't, then neither are these people. But what you're doing is what you're trying to say is there's a distinction between certain black people and other black people, and you create that distinction, right? And it becomes a marker so that if a person doesn't make a lot of money, if they're not well educated, then that's what you call them. Kind of like the Chris Rock thing, right? So here's the kick in the chest, because in America, it's never simple. Those 15 people or 16 people, there were like 2 whites in that group, or at least people who presented as white. The other 14 presented as black people. You see how deep that got? Yeah. And that's internalized ideas about, this is who these people are, kind of. So, anyway, I don't know, sorry, there's 2 kind of people in the world, the kind of people who can focus, and then there goes a squirrel. And so I'll take a couple other questions, else I'll just go ahead.
So my question is not related to the museum, but more related to the work that you do at Ferris State as the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. So I'm just kind of wondering, what kind of, do you feel like you get support from the university, as that position? And then, how many people are working in that department? I work for the Office of Diversity Education here. So just what do y'all do? What's happening over there?
So the easy answer is, from the very first day when I took my job, I created the office. So that was the day. So that's good and bad. It's good because I don't have a predecessor who walked on water, and I don't have to walk on water. So that's the good part. The bad part is I didn't have a predecessor who walked on water, who had done a bunch of stuff, right? So one of the first things I decided is that everything we do will be public. And so we created a web presence where we spent 6 months arguing over what's diversity. And I didn't mind. I did not mind. We argued. I mean, for real argued. We came up with a definition which now other people try to steal. And I tell them, don't steal our definition. You need the argument. Your campus needs to engage. You get what I mean? You need to have the argument. So it took us 6 months to do that. The inclusion part was relatively quick. And then we as a campus came up with a plan. And every college And every division creates a diversity plan. Now, some of them do a poor job of it. Their reports are uneven, but they're held accountable because whatever they produce, I share with the world, and I share with our board of trustees. Okay, so that's one part. In terms of the office itself, we even though we didn't have my office, we had an office of multicultural student services, which had resulted from students striking in the 1980s. So we had that office. Since my office was created, I advocated for the creation of a Latino center, which we've created, and a international center, which we've created. And the biggest fight was an LGBTQ plus center. That was the biggest fight. As a matter of fact, I would have, if I were a betting man, which unfortunately I am, I would have taken good odds that that was never going to happen at that school. As a matter of fact, when I first got my job, I didn't think I was going to get my job. I was a professor at my school. We may want to turn that off here in a minute. But I was a professor at my school. I went for my job just to tell the school what it needed to do. And so I had a list of 6 or 8 things which I was positive would never get done, or would take a lot of fighting to get done. And then I got the job. And all of a sudden, because it's different from being the person who's banging on the table than being the person who's now got to make this happen, right? And I was really, really good at banging on the table. I mean, this would all be purple and blue, telling folks what they need to do. So long story short, those people don't report to me. And yet, for many years, I've been responsible for them, which is unfair. And I've had that discussion with the president, with a bunch of people. But my leadership is mostly lateral leadership, which means I work with that group and others. And so we've made it work. And my office itself the Jim Crow Museum has like 3.5 people that work there. They report to me. And then my office, I have an administrative assistant, and then I have 2 other people that work with me. And then I have any number of people, and those people report to me, but then I have other people that work with me. So, I was tempted at many instances to go to a school where all the diversity stuff is in one place, because it's a lot easier, at least presumably easier, to get people to do something if they report to you. So you say, well, do the report. No, I don't want to do it. Okay, you got to go, And that's different from me having to convince the VP in your area to have you do it while working with you. And yet we've made it work. But I would say it's, the most complex organizational diversity structure I've seen was probably the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is like millions of dollars poured into a diversity structure. More common is the one where there's only the one person or 1.5. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Even at the places like the University of Wisconsin or Berkeley or whatever, they have the same problems the rest of us have. Achievement gaps among students of color and white students, recruiting and retaining faculty and staff of color, and hostile in climates and environment. They have the same. As a matter of fact, some of them have worse than that. So this is what I know that works. All right, in terms of recruiting, and I say this, and we rank near the bottom. In terms of recruiting and retaining a staff of color, the one thing that works is when the people that head the area say it's going to happen. So if you're going to go do a search, when you come back, the pool has to include people from various groups. And then you don't tell them who to hire. You just make sure that the work went into that, and they tell the people that they value this. I've seen it work. I've just seen it work over and over again. In terms of the achievement gaps piece, what works there, and this is going to sound a little weird, is often the non-academic stuff, right? because a lot of students of color leave not for academic reasons, right? And so focusing on climate pieces while at the same time taking places that are mostly social and giving them an academic component. So like if you have an Office of Multicultural Student Services, having an academic component and the resources there too, right? And for us, the best thing about climate, the best way to work on climate is we just talk it to death. We talk it to death. And here's the reason for that. If students don't know, or faculty, or whoever it is, don't know that they're going to have an opportunity to talk about issues, then when they get their one opportunity, they ain't going to ever stop talking. And they're going to stand up there and they're going to create hero narratives or victim narratives where they're the hero or the victim because this is their one chance to get their words out, right? But if you know every Tuesday, right? Every Tuesday or every other Thursday or whatever it is, the administrators, the staff, people, we're going to sit and we're going to really, really talk. So during the Montgomery bus boycott, somebody paid some money, or right after the bus boycott, after that in Birmingham, someone paid money for open seats at a diner for white supremacists and civil rights workers. All they have to do is not hit each other and then come in there and eat. These are groups that you wouldn't think would be able to talk. If those folks can talk, we can talk, okay? So I don't know if that's helped. That's the other me. And I just got another job too, by the way, and so that's causing some consternation on our campus, which is I've just been made Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. And so some people are thinking that now that means I don't care about diversity anymore. So I want to tell you a couple things about Martin Luther King before I leave, all right, that you may not know. 2 weeks after the Montgomery bus boycott started, someone threw dynamite on his, everybody know that? And his wife was okay. He was giving a speech. His wife, Coretta, and their 7-month-old child, Yolanda, were not injured. And he came back from the talk, and his house was surrounded by angry African Americans, and that's when he started being someone else. He got in touch with his inner angel and said, "No, we're not gonna fight back. We're not gonna go get guns." I mean, okay. So that was that. You know that when he wrote the book about the Montgomery bus boycott, that he was stabbed in the chest in Harlem. And that was an African-American woman who came up and asked him, "Are you Martin Luther King?" He said, "Yes." She stabbed him in the chest. And while the cold steel of a metal opener was still surrounded by warm blood, they took him to the Harlem hospital, told him if he had sneezed, he would have died. And of course, being a Southern preacher, Southern black preacher, he turned it into a sermon, right? So I'm glad I didn't, he turned it into a sermon. And but the one I did not know, and I knew that there were times when, and I have instances where people punched him. When he went to Chicago, which he claimed was the worst of all the things. He went to Chicago for fair housing for poor people. They were pelted with bricks, with stones, with bottles. Someone threw a knife at him. He said he had never seen anything like that. But the one I didn't know was he was going to give a talk in Los Angeles, and the police got an anonymous tip that someone was going to bomb the place. See, and by the way, when I was a kid, we used to call Birmingham Bombingham. And so after 9/11, when people start saying that, bombings have come to America, that's insulting to people who grew up during the Civil Rights Movement and had to face bombings all the time, right? But anyhow, the police got an anonymous tip, and someone had stolen and was prepared to use 1,400 pounds of dynamite. I didn't say sticks of dynamite. I don't know how much a stick weighs, but it doesn't weigh a pound. 1,400 pounds of dynamite. They meant to kill him. And I'll give you another one you may not know. I don't know if you know the name Chester White. I think it's Chester White. He was a black guy, wasn't involved in the civil rights movement, wasn't involved in voting rights. He just living. And was living in Natchez, Mississippi, was deferential to white people because that's how he'd been raised. And so a couple of white guys said to him, hey, we lost our dog. We'll give you a couple dollars and a soda if you help us find our dog. And he got together with them, and they killed him. And the reason they killed him was because they thought that a senseless death would get the attention of Martin Luther King, who would come to Natchez, and then they would kill him. And so, you know, when you're a kid growing up down south, you hear the 23rd Psalm, right? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall what? For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff. This man literally lived the last 14 years of his life. And stop saying he gave his life. His life was taken. And he was murdered, cold-blooded murder. Assassination just cleans that up. He was cold-blooded murder, right? For the last 14 years of his life, he lived under the shadow, in the valley of the shadow of death. And it's almost inevitable then, when you look back over the course that he would have died. So, and finally, and then I'm going to shut up, I promise you. I gave a talk one time, and when it was over, there was a young African-American kid. And so I said to him, because I like to ask kids, so what are you going to do when you grow up? And he said, I don't know if he was just being a difficult or whatever, but he said, what difference does it make? And he had listened to me talk. And I says, what do you mean? Don't you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, or somebody great like a sociologist or something, right? And he was like, what difference does it make? And then I looked in that kid's eyes and I realized the picture that I had painted was so horrible of what people had gone through, right? That I'd sucked the hope out of this kid. And the next time I spoke, I gave a talk that was nothing but about accomplishments and achievements, stuff that people don't even know, little known facts. And a guy came up to me after and he said, but what about the struggle? I'm like, I'll be damned. I can't win. I can't win either way here. So my point is, yes, there is a struggle. There is a struggle. But to quote Ronald Reagan, or to reference Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, we can be that city on the hill. I really do believe that. Despite, I know stuff you don't know. I know some things much worse than what I told you tonight. And I still believe in this country. I still believe we can be that city on the top of the hill. I do. Thank you very much.